Could I please request everybody to stand for the national anthem?
In Sri Lanka, it is the macro development planning that initiates the production of urban physical spaces. Architects claim to the right to take part in creating such urban physical spaces is the objective of this webinar. Our worldview has changed since 17 November 2019. The lifestyle as well as the connection to the physical space around other human beings have made many think about redesigning the way we live, work and patronize the facilities of the house, neighborhood, township and the city as a whole. Perhaps the famous quotation by Sir Winston Churchill is valid in the scenario of global pandemic. We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. If so, architects can reshape the diseased cities when the needs of citizens change. It is argued here that creative thinking of architects, urban designers and planners in spatial planning take account of spatial dimensions of economics to cause the wealth distribution or positioning of people and their activities. Therefore, designing and restructuring the neighborhoods, townships and cities we live in will create a socio-economic impact. Therefore, the need of the hour is to reimagine the role and the paradox of the current practice of architecture in relation to production of urban space. It's all too common to hear that we as professionals are powerless to affect the industry due to lack of agency, that is, capability to act by themselves. The mission is to claim the right to take part in creating the social space. Thinking outside the box, the new agency will be a union of companionship with politicians, policymakers, other experts and end users that will address the societal problems. The word proposition is preferred to speculation, and the modes of delivery shall be subtle and gentle as territorial jiu-jitsu in the commercial world of speculative development. The events unfolding around the world are undeniably urgent and significant. The challenges that we face are monumental in scale. We are living through a socio-political, economical, and a medical crisis never encountered before. Therefore, this ECPD has invited experts in the fields of architecture, urban design, planning, and economics to create new synergies for engagement in producing new urban inclusive spaces. This will be the new spatial agency to conceive the notion of right to the city.
Before we begin today's proceedings, could I please invite our panel to seat themselves at the head table? Dr. Vagesha Gunasekara, Architect Professor Chitra Vedikara, Architect Dr. Lochana Gunaratna, Architect Professor Indrika Rajapaksha, Architect Dr. Upendra Rajapaksha, Architect Professor Lal Balasurya, Architect Harshan De Silva, Architect Pali Vijayaratna, Architect Dr. Janaka Vijay Sundara, Architect Hiranti Velendave, Architect B.B. Navaratna, and Architects Randini and Dr. Senaka. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first ECPD Q&A session for 2020-2021 on the topic Inclusive Cities, how social justice can be brought to the production of space in the city. Today's panel comprises the diverse group of professionals who are experts in the fields of sociology, economy, and architecture, and have compared today's topic against themes of socioeconomy, geopolitics, and spatial urban development. Here to welcome you all and explain today's topic of inclusive cities, please welcome Architect Upendra Randenia, Chairman of the Professional Affairs Board, SLIA.
Welcome to the first ECPD, which is live streamed on YouTube. I take this opportunity to thank resource persons providing recording and attending the Q&A session, council members, PAB members, CPD committee, to making this event a success. Special thanks go to the member, Madhava Dharmatilaka, son of architect Senaka, who helped us to edit this presentation. Sponsor Teyan Lanka Steel Company Private Limited. Usually CPDs are conducted here, physical forum with at least 250 members, followed by a Q&A session. Due to lockdown, this format was changed, allowing 1,500 members to remain at home and use the web portal for viewing. This will be the new mode of conducting CPDs in the future. Most other professionals have done this already. Besides the CPDs, which usually happens at least 4 or 5 every year, we also have a national conference, which is held annually, and we invite experts to contribute their knowledge on a selected topic. The new topic is selected every year and discussed in detail. While this allows discussion on new topics, it does not allow continuity. However, some national issues demand continuous attention, such as this topic. Social justice can be brought to production of space in the city. If you listen to the talks that were delivered, you will notice that they are very complex and the solutions are elusive. It seems that we all agree in principle that there should be justice in the city development. It appears that each of us differ when it comes to how to achieve it. Therefore, we urgently need a common language that we could understand among the divisions that we already have. Policy planning, national physical plan, planning, urban design, architecture, and the vast majority who doesn't have a voice. So what we suggest is SLI to take the lead and create a lingua franca, that is a language that all of us understand in order to link these little dots that are scattered. The purpose of being to facilitate communication among interested parties to carry out the message and to bridge the gap between the bottom, the people, and the policymakers at the top. So I use this chance to tell the membership that we need to have a similar topic on our agenda of CPDs, where this theme is continued, and we can have sub-themes every year, so that there is a continuity, and we become the leader in creating this language to talk to the interested parties. The event unfolding around the world are undeniably urgent and significant. Challenges that we face are monumental in scale with COVID. Thus, I suggest that we create a spatial agency where knowledge-based, evidence-based research is presented next year. We will refer to research that will take place as well as projects that is specific to the Sri Lankan context, both in terms of policy and design. This gives SLI a new agenda, that is to communicate this message to the public and the policymakers that we take part in looking after the voiceless. This will be the legacy of the PAB 2021. Thank you.
Thank you, Architect Randinia. Before we begin session 1, please also welcome our moderator for the evening, Architect D.B. Navaratna, Consultant Architect, Conservator and Urban Designer, and our expert panel for the evening, starting with Architect Dr. Senaka Dharmatilaka, Chairman of the Continuous Professional Development Committee, who provided an introduction into today's topic where he claims that production of space in the city has always been a struggle. This is further explained in 3 separate theories, namely Pierre Bourdieu's concept of habitus defines this as an accumulation of capital, economical, social, cultural, symbolic capitals. André Lefebvre introduced the concept of surplus accumulation, identifies lived, perceived, conceived space, and right to the city. David Harvey's talks of planetary urbanization in relation to global processes.
So with these narratives of Lefebvre and Harvey, we hear how in the West, how these oligarchic political influences on the urban development, how they disenfranchise the urban citizens right to the city and in the transformation of urban spaces. Now, however, we have witnessed in our comparative successes that we have achieved in controlling these current epidemic situations, which is in contrast to the Western approaches. And here we could see how our welfare state policies, as opposed to the laissez-faire policies of the neoliberalistic West, would have different results. And so similarly, we need to see how our focus, the scale and the proportion of our investment in state-sponsored affordable housing as a ray of hope, so to speak. So we discussed how Bourdieu explains the role played by capital in the struggle for the right to the city in terms of social capital, cultural capital and financial capital. But in contrast, how we may see, how we may remain optimistic in a civilization such as ours, in a civilization that believes in spiritual capital, people who believe in the spiritual bank accounts, investing in spiritual bank accounts, etc., where we treat the needy, the helpless, as a moral obligation rather than a legal obligation. How the urban poor amidst the population that engages in making such deposits in spiritual bank accounts, how would they be treated? And we have seen this mass sentiments of our nation, which is rich with values of compassion, which we have demonstrated not only in the situations of crisis, of natural calamities, but also in the field of war, field of battle. And it is in this, in the midst of this mass scale real estate development in our city centers, how do we see or how do we remain hopeful that there will be innovative urban development policies will be formulated at a broader scale or at a macro scale, which would ensure the welfare of our underprivileged communities who populate our major cities. Where would they fit in our grand schemes, and how would the economic prosperity or the wealth we gain by this mass growth be trickled down to them, or how would they form part of this great big picture of us, of a great big future and a great big urban future. Thank you.
And start with that Dr. Senaka Dharmatilaka's introductory note, but I would like you to go through the total lecture or total presentation that he made in the recordings. So you better if you have not read, I think it is best that you read it or listen to it rather, and then comprehend what doctor is trying to say. I'm very grateful because your he has brought in vivid theoretical knowledge into one place to discuss this issue what we are discussing today. So I'm very thankful, and it will be okay. It will be also be very helpful for architectural and urban design students or planning students, for them to get a basic understanding of what the questions that we are discussing and the theoretical background of that. So thank you, Senaka, for that excellent presentation that you have done in the YouTube. So on that, I have okay, I'll first explain how I'm going to conduct this moderation of these lectures. First, the summary, like what we did, will come in, and then after that, I will ask each and every panelist or the speaker a set of questions, or one question or one or two questions. Unfortunately, some of them are missing here. What I'm trying to do is trying to bring out certain conclusions at the end of our it's very difficult task for you to bring in conclusions of these sort of subject area, but at least some understanding so that we know where to focus and when to focus. So I think that is what my intention is today. We will see how we will succeed. Something fascinated me with Dr. Senaka's listening to his total speech was that you're saying that some of the contextual factors you are bringing in are perhaps contrary to the theories that we are looking at, or not contrary, okay, maybe complementary, or you can tell me what it means. Say, for example, you are bringing in religious thinking into, say, the picture, and the equity, social equity, sometimes is accepted in the parts of South Asian and the Sri Lankan region, considered it as a, because religion gives you a background to justify the situation. And that is something interesting which is not written in any of those books that you have referred to. So sometimes we do not fight, or we do not ask for our position in the urban context, our position in terms of spatial as well as activity. We don't ask it because we accept our position, and particularly majority Buddhists, but even Christians, Sri Lankans, and there are also Hindus. All of them have this religious and cultural background which sets you for this sort of mindset. Now that accept certain things that will be considered as unjust in another part of the world, which is written by them in their books and those other theories that we read. And having said that, then some of the references that you have made it into Marxisms and Marxism-based spatial theories, and those are well known theories. So in this context, my first discussion point for you to react to is, do you think that in South Asian context, do we have to work out our own theories and our own way of looking at this equity issue? Because the way that we are looking at in a socialist environment or a communist environment or a European environment might be different to ours. So in that context, how do we, what do you think that we should be doing? And I'm linking this with Dr. Janaka, who is doing experiments and research on these fields. And when I come to that, I will link this up with him as well, the things that we are looking at, and say, can you respond to that? Can you think that, say, is there a difference in what the Western or rather the political or those approaches and our approach should be in our cultural and religious context?
Thank you, sir. Yes, actually speaking, what we need to look at is not only the difference between the East and the West, not only about space. Yes, the space differentiates different cultural clusterings, socio-religious clusterings, which have different norms, beliefs, and especially values. I think values would be the key thing to look at. And also, not only space, but also time. Now, the problem of most of us is we are looking at certain, our problems in terms of theoretical frameworks given by different cultures, especially the West. Even this fluidity that is brought in by time is not only specific to the regions, but within the same region itself, you will see how these values change. For an example, now David Harvey would look at how the West itself, the capitalist exploitation changes even from the time Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848 to the current days. For an example, the capitalist structures as well as the structures of labor has changed significantly. If you take the 1960s to 70s, the biggest employer of US labor were three companies: General Motors, which is automobile industry, Ford, again automobile industry, and US Steel, heavy industries. Now, in the current days, what are who are the main employers of the major employers of US labor? First, Walmart, Megamart company, right? And then the holding company of McDonald's, and the holding company of Kentucky Fried Chicken, or KFC. Now, this labor, the structures of labor itself has changed even within their own geographic territories. And the levels of exploitation, the modes of exploitation have changed drastically from one area to the other. Now, you can look at this, even this difference that you'll have to see in not looking at the Sri Lankan context or the Eastern context in terms of the Western theoretical framework, could be seen even in terms of how the deployment labor and the structuring of labor has changed there, right? So my answer is yes. In terms of adopting theoretical frameworks, our failure so far have been that we are adapting alien frameworks of analysis into specific locality because we generalize these theoretical frameworks. Now, similarly, you can see how even the geographic distribution of labor. Now, normally, people would look at labor as and exploitation as happening on the factory floors, just like the 60s to 50s, 60s to 70s. But now he looks at how the labor, just like the structures of labor has changed, the exploitation happens not only in terms of their efforts and the contribution in terms of work, but also in terms of time. How these structures have changed so much. I'm taking only one example as a case study, just to show how these theoretical frameworks cannot be kind of used by generalization in certain areas, like what Dr. Vagisha would say. Cities are built on capitalist structures, and capitalist structures are built on social inequalities and environmental injustices. Fantastic way of looking at it, actually. So while we have this theoretical framework on a macro scale, but the modes and means of exploitation have changed. And in answer, what I have to say is, in finding answers, we may need to change our lenses, or the the spectacles we look at the specific environments, without strictly adhering to the theoretical approaches or theoretical frameworks taken to analyze the cities, the built environments, and how this exploitation happens on societies. I hope that gives a general answer. I would expect Dr. Janaka to kind of continue on the rest.
Thank you. I think we came into a good point where we are trying to say that, of course, we learn in theory, lots of theories, Western theories and Eastern theories, everything. But at the end, as a professional, one should do contextualization of this. I think that is what is expected out of us. So I think that is somewhere that I want to direct this discussion, because almost everybody was talking of theory, but then it has a little bit of unmatch or certain condition which we can't say sometimes put into practice. Sometimes that is where we, Dr. Seneka, sometimes that is where we went wrong, because we learn theory and in the schools, and then we try to apply it on the ground, and we have not made it contextualized. And I think this is where I will get in with Dr. Janaka. How do we get on to the, say what are the common features that we could get from these theories while contextualizing the answers? So that is something that I will leave for the moment. Then say we'll have Dr. Vagisha. Is there a presentation on that?
Thank you, Dr. Seneka. Our next panelist, Dr. Vagisha Gunasekara, is a senior lecturer at the Department of Social Studies at the Open University of Sri Lanka and the executive director of the American Institute for Lankan Studies. Her topic was a critical overview of the effects of urbanization in Sri Lanka, socio-political and economic paradigms, in which she claims that the kind of research and evidence that we should produce is the kind that allows us to understand social reproduction through spatial or infrastructure realities. We need to better understand how the processes of infrastructure development, coupled with market forces, are reconstructing people's identity, livelihoods, and ways of life, and thereby the kind of state-society relations we have.
I recently had a conversation with a CEO of a top garment manufacturer. We talked about their impressive green, eco-friendly green initiatives. But when I asked whether they have thought of apportioning some of that budget that goes towards sustainability practices towards increasing the pay scales of the workers, in other words, better pay for the workers, he was not very keen. Now, he said, well, that affects the bottom line, he said. What I'm trying to say here is that it's not enough to promote the recycling of plastic bottles in cities without questioning the privatization of water, for example. The so-called triple bottom line, allegedly reconciling profits, planet, and people, the triple bottom line, often sums up into reshaping environmental crisis to the market's ends. The main reason why social justice is often an afterthought is because capitalist processes are built on social inequalities. And of course, environmental injustices are also part and parcel of capitalist processes. When state and planning institutions claim to be concerned with equity, we need to pay careful attention to whether these concerns and initiatives are based on delivering equitable outcomes in the first place. Drawing on Henri Lefebvre's The Right to the City, and observing the tension between the three pillars of sustainability, we need to think about a new centrality, a new urban society, a different urban mode of production, one that embodies social justice and ecological consciousness. Urban transitions motivated by green neoliberalism will only aggravate existing polarizations, because this kind of urban transition rides on the backs of people living in the periphery of the urban economy and living in the periphery of the urban society. A just transition will improve transportation for all and create new green jobs, but it will also give voice and agency to the people. This is not just about planning for the future. We have to factor in the past and the present social injustices and make an effort to rectify them. Urbanization should not be an excuse to disguise or ignore exploitative practices of the current economic model that drives it. As David Harvey states, we cannot resolve difficulties by pretending that they do not exist. Such an approach has been in practice for so long, in fact too long. The urban transition that we must work towards must not leave behind social justice. Balancing social justice and environmental protection with regards to urbanization must go hand in hand. And if we come up with a long-term formula to achieve this, the outcome, no doubt, will be revolutionary and transformative. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I sat through total your talk, and I was listening it very carefully, and I think I listened twice. Because it is so fantastic that you are trying to connect context of economic, social, and political changes and trying to bring it into urban context and not being a spatial professional, like space creating professional. So it is very enlightening that what you discussed. I had a issue, and you gave a sort of an answer at the end of your summary. The word was revolutionary, because how much we try in the existing system that this unjust we might not be able to defeat, because it's very difficult revolution, because it is not only that Sri Lanka or this country or the Asian region is trapped with. It is a global trap that we are in. So that is why I think global environmental organizations, Habitat, and different global organizations are also trying to address these issues. So in that sense, I still don't see what sort of a revolution that we are talking of, because say you in the main body of your talk, you're talking of the patchworks won't do. It is true, because what we are doing is we are showing, say, as the example that you took with the, say, these companies which are doing social justice and all that, because they're not, they're just showing off that we are doing it. And even isn't the capitalist free market economy driven governments are also doing the same in a different way. So what is the revolution that we are looking and expecting, and how do you propose, say, to do it?
Thank you for that question, Chair. Well, I think what I have to say in response is neither profound nor anything new. I think all of you in this audience have heard these things, and it's also, it may sound very utopian once again, not too different from what I say in the video. I think the kind of revolution that I'm talking about is one that we rethink this idea of progress, how we understand progress. And what I'm proposing is a change in our entire operating system of the economy. And we actually have a great example in front of us, that is nature. I mean, if you look at living systems that have existed for a couple of billion years, few billion years, materials flow, one species' waste is another one's food, right? Energy is provided by the sun, things grow and die, and nutrients return to the soil. That's the natural system, and this is cyclical, it's circular. But humans, us, we have adopted an economic system and a life that is linear, not circular, right? We take, we make, and we dispose. Like our phones. We have a phone. Once we are tired of it, once it's out of date, we toss it and we get a new one, right? We move in a linear way, defying nature. So this economic system that is quite linear, we are eating into finite resources and often producing toxic waste, a huge problem in urban locations. So can't we think of maybe a circular economy that mimics the natural operating system? I know this might sound really idealistic to all of you who, I mean, to me too, it sounds very idealistic, but this is not my idea. These ideas are circulating around the world. Can waste build capital? That's a question we could ask. Can the goods of today become resources of tomorrow? Instead of throw and replace, can we think of, adopt an attitude maybe to return and renew things? So this also means we have to rethink this idea of ownership. We don't really own technologies or things, but we simply license them. Can we think of a system like that? So what that means is it's an economic system where the product comes back to the maker. You reuse the technical material. The biological waste or the biological material is used to improve agriculture. All the goods are transported using renewable energy, right? Of course, this sounds utopian because none of us know a world like this, right? But then, so this is, what I'm proposing is the circular economy, but for this to work, everybody has to do it. It can't be that one company does it and the rest of them don't. And it also means that we have to interconnect all the companies and industries that form or contribute to our infrastructure. So in a sense, what I'm proposing is the circular economy is about rethinking our operating system that entails three things, which is design out waste and pollution. Number two is keep products and materials in use, right? And number three, regenerate natural systems. So I suppose that's the sort of the revolutionary model that I have read about, that I have, and actually companies are doing this. currently it's not it's not pie in the sky, or it's not infeasible. Does that answer your question, at least provisionally?
Yeah, I know it's a difficult question because, I mean, nobody can answer in one sentence or within 5 minutes to that question. But I think you touched a very nice point. I think progressive understanding, that is something that we need to get. I don't think it's only, say, in our context, Sri Lankan context, but this understanding of the context and what is going on will bring out the answers, actually. But I think the issue here is that ignorance is the issue, because we do not understand what is happening around us, and so therefore we don't know what to change and when to change and where to change. So I think I will, if you bring back into the spatial context of this, that I think professionals as architects, planners, and urban designers, those who are here, we should be aware and vigilant about that, so that we try to give this understanding to general public, because this revolution cannot be done by the professionals themselves. The revolution should come from the society itself. So that it is our duty in that sense. My conclusion is that as much as possible, as per our ability, we must inform the community and the society, this is what is going on, and therefore we should change it, so that first we have to dissipate, or say we have to give information to them, and then they will come back and tell us, okay, you do it, right? So I think that's maybe the tactic or strategy that we could use in this context. So I will thank you again. Yes, you have a point, yes.
Just add a little thing, and that is just in response to, what I was saying, and then also what you were saying. We talk about urbanization and social justice, and we like to use Lafay and Right to the City and all that, but I have read several global discourses on Right to the Village as well. So maybe another way of thinking differently about space and social justice is to focus on not to be so urban-centric when it comes to planning and design. Instead of having this sort of urban-centric spatial bias, why don't we try and understand why urbanization happens in the first place, right? And then that takes us all the way back to the rural areas, the decline of the rural economies and the social inequalities between the dominant and the dominated in the rural areas. So, and that's what causes the growing mobility to the cities, and then in turn the inequalities that you see in the cities. So I would just like to stop with that, saying that maybe as much as it's important to talk about Right to the City, maybe we should also think about Right to the Village, because you can't really separate these two from each other.
Thank you for that comment. Actually, it leads to two other speakers who have spoken. I think this links to some of Professor Balasuriya's thinking as well as Dr. Lochana Gunaratna's thinking. I think, we will discuss this, what you just touched upon on urban and on the rural contexts, and they have got some ideas and thoughts about this, and we will discuss when we come to those speakers. And thank you. And it's nice that another professional, another thinker comes out of this, and then we would be able to discuss this in the same table with other two professionals here, and on the same lines. So I leave it at that, and then I'll get into with Professor Chitra Vedikara's presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Vagisha. Next, we welcome architect QS Professor Chitra Vedikara, who is a past president of SLIA and is also the dean of the Colombo School of Construction Technology. Her expertise in building economics and current construction trends was expanded under her topic, Equity in Urban Growth and Building Economics, where she states that equity be redefined under the paradigms of justice, distribution of wealth, and social protection.
So equity is one of the most important aspects in any developing country or even in developed countries. That means equity for urban equity for all those people who live in the cities, whether you are rich or poor. And also there is something called City for Life that has been brought by the Seventh Urban Forum which I think is a fantastic concept, City for Life. So as far as we are concerned, as architects, engineers, conservators, we must look at this phenomenon of urban equity in development, and it is an important phenomenon. Unequal cities have difficulties to optimize, and therefore it is difficult for them to achieve this concept, cities for life. So we as architects, the answer is equity development. How do we go about equity development? Making sure that there is a framework, there is a national policy, and also policy has various projects that are useful to the urban people, right? And then making sure that architects, engineers, conservators, and urban designers, urban planners, that we as to promote urban equity and development of cities and enhance this concept called City for Life. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I think equity is, say, right topic for Professor Vedikara because she always give all of us equal standards, and I know, say, that's her character. So equity is nothing new to you, madam. I say it is true that we all talk in this equity in these terms. However, I think achieve equity in a free market economic context, where wealth distribution is not controlled, and therefore the gap between have and have-nots is increasing and ever increasing. So in this context is the context in which that we work and that we try to bring this equity in place. Professor, I know it's a hard question if I ask how do you do this, because it's a absolutely conceptual or utopian answer that you will have to give. But what I'm asking is, what do you think, because we have been in this economy from 1977, if I call it right, and we are now getting into the, say, we are experiencing the outcomes of this economic system that we have been adopting. So in this context, what is missing, what are the parts we might not be able to resolve it 100%, but is there anything that we could do to come closer to this concept that you were talking of?
Thanks, Nawa. Equity for me is leveling the playing field politically, socially, and economically. But it is one of the most difficult things in any country, even in Sri Lanka. So I think in order to achieve equity, you must have a mindset of people, politicians, and the country as a whole. So I am not 100% sure, Nawa, how we can achieve it in the current context. But if you are looking at communism or anything like that, that kind of thing always gives a level playing field to everybody. But in a democratic society, I don't think you can ever achieve equity for everyone. But what we can do is, as you say, reduce the impact of this for the poor, because, for example, in the City for Life, what we are looking at is everybody should be able to live in that city, so that most of the infrastructure, most of the functions, most of the facilities are available to people. But people's culture, people's attitudes, change this equity equation. For example, you know that if you have slum development in closer to any of our high-rise developments, nobody will buy those apartments, okay? Because that is a social stigma. So how do we do that? So that is where the government also must be inclusive in terms of social justice, equity, and find what kind of trade-offs that we can give so that you can balance them. But as human beings, we will never ever be satisfied with what we get. So equity is one of those questions I think is the most difficult thing or concept that is very, very difficult to have in a society. So I feel that we have to come together and make sure that we can work towards it. But I'm not sure in my lifetime whether there will be any way in which every person who is very poor has the same thing that the rich has, because it will never happen. Unless, of course, we have a dictatorship and everybody says, you do it, you do it, you do it, and that's the only way. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. That brought us into say, your example brought us into a new avenue of thinking. That is, say, occupation of occupying space. How do we occupy space? Because, as you said, rich and the poor. Say, it's not also expected equal. Say, and there is, say, in this context, say, due to power, could be monetary, could be political, could be religious, etc., etc. And this democratic system allows it to exist within the system, so that positioning of your locational positioning of your power, and as Seneca little time ago said, in time, because certain times, certain powers will be in high, and they will occupy certain spaces whether we like it or not. So I think equity on that controlling is another task by itself. So I think how do we bring the society into an equal status or equity or spatial equity is in question. So I think we'll have to accept that context and then see within that how do we find the answers. So thank you, Professor, for your contribution. So let's go to the next speaker. That is Professor Willie Mendes. Professor Willie Mendes is not here, but I think we have a clip, is it? We do have. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Chitra. Although Professor Willie is not present, I will be presenting his summary as well. Professor Willie Mendes is the Vice Chancellor of the University of Moratuwa, as well as the past President of the Engineering, Architecture and Surveying Section, Sri Lanka Association for the Advancement of Science. Professor Mendes discussed the topic, a fresh look at the implementation strategies, which he states that the aims and objectives of the National Physical Plan is to integrate the internal elements into a production approach for the economy to grow, and that the National Physical Plan is developed and updated regularly to match the National Policy Plan. Highlighting the gaps between the two entities, he suggests the need to bridge the gap. Unfortunately, Professor Mendes was not able to attend today's session due to an unavoidable circumstance. Now we welcome architect Dr. Loshana Gunaratna.
Can I make a small comment on Professor Willie Mendes' paper or presentation, which is in the YouTube? And you could read through that and then say, one of the points that, although he say, you know, he's very polite and very politely telling, say, in his speech, a very strong point. What he is trying to say is very unfortunate for us to hear this also. We sometimes have a economic and financial policy, development policies and things like that, but then it is not represented in the physical plan, or there's no combination of that, or in the implementation it fails. So this is a fundamental issue, I think, as all Sri Lankans, professionals and us should be very considerate of. He puts it in very lighter and smaller words, but it's a big issue. Because if you have an economic or financial or political or what policy it is, and then it has to be on ground, it has to be related in a physical planning process and then implementation process. So what he is basically saying is that is lacking in our country, and we as professionals should try to resolve it, try to get into the system and try to find answers, because what he see is that we are out of the administrative and political system as professionals. So as far as we stay there, we will not be able to bring out a change. So that is what he's briefly saying, I think. That is something that I would like to conclude with, yes.
Thank you, sir. Now we welcome architect Dr. Lochana Gunaratna, who is a past president of the Sri Lanka Institute of Architects and also past president of the Sri Lanka Association for the Advancement of Science. His topic was ensuring equitable urban growth in managing urbanization, in which he argues that evidence-based research on low and middle-income countries, LMIC, indicates that poverty-driven rural push is more than the urban pull. The need of the hour is to initiate mechanisms to promote medium and small towns in the rural sector as service centers to reduce the urban migration.
It must thus be concluded that urbanization in the LMICs can be equitable and a phenomenon of great good for all, provided it is directed less to the larger cities than to the mid-sized urban places. This can be achieved through sound and focused urban planning. Now, in the light of the foregoing discussion, the key recommendations relating to the need for the intervention through national policies on urbanization in the LMICs are: 1. The promotion of planned urbanization as opposed to the reliance on market forces and or ad hoc planning. 2. The concurrent focus on agriculture and rural development to ensure that urbanization will be an equitable process. 3. The planned development of small towns with efficient urban governance to provide equitable access to social and economic infrastructure for their residents, and also, importantly, for their respective rural hinterlands. 4. The planned development of medium-sized towns with efficient urban governance to function as ready target locations for rural migrants as alternatives to primary cities. 5. And the last, the need to recognize the serious health hazards that are inherent and hard to combat in dense ghettoized populations in large cities, especially in the context of a pandemic. These recommendations, if implemented, will surely help us in managing urbanization for equitable urban growth in the LMIC. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. I think you're one of the say persons who has brought some answer to the question that we are dealing with. So I think we have to take this your proposal very seriously and discuss it further, because what you are trying to say basically with your 5 or 6 recommendations, but basically this push-pull factor to be balanced, at one point, and so that you get a equitable answer. I have a small question on acceptability due to the, say, Sri Lankan, of this in Sri Lankan context, because still we have the, say, all Sri Lankans have this mentality of coming into the city, having a greater choice for their, say, all needs. They will have a greater choice, and they would like to come into the main city and occupy that, and that becomes their, say, sort of big thing to say about, okay, I'm in Colombo, or I'm in Kandy, and I'm living in this particular place, and that is, that factor is there. That's sort of cultural or egoistic and that sort of thing. So in this concept of, say, trying to pull them back into the smaller scales or smaller cities, what do you think? Is it, say, will with all these facilities getting into these smaller or townships, do you think that it will change our mindset? What do you think, Doctor?
Well, I don't think that it is possible to give all the facilities that are in large cities into make it available to all people in the rural sector. But what we can do is to move towards providing some of the facilities. That's to answer your particular question. This can be done. You know, it is impossible to think of rural areas, say some rural village, having all the facilities that are available in a city. It's impossible, you know. So what you can do is to provide certain towns with the facilities, particularly the social infrastructure. That is, schools and medical facilities, health facilities, at central locations to a few rural areas, to villages. And this can make it possible for these people to have access to this. But if they want to have more, they can move to medium-sized cities, you know, or there will be a range of cities, small, medium, and large cities. So this is possible. As a matter of fact, in our National Physical Plan, which was done originally in 2007, these small and medium-sized cities are mentioned, not only mentioned, they are mapped and indicated. What we have not done is to implement those plans. You know, if we implement those plans, there will be a much greater level of equity available to the rural folk. Now, this will also reduce the number of people who have no alternative but to come into the big cities like Colombo. I mean, they come with hopes, but it is very difficult to satisfy those hopes when they get here because they become ghettoized into shanty communities. And it is, I mean, they become subject to, fortunately in Sri Lanka, things are not as bad as they would be in India. But in that ghettoized situation, they are susceptible to health risks and so on. You know, so many problems are there. So they come with hopes, but those hopes are not necessarily realized, So that is why I'm suggesting that we look at the small and medium-sized cities, and we can very easily provide facilities which will enable these people to enjoy more equity. That's what I have to say to your question.
Thank you. One more question from you, because I think you have touched two areas, not only this. Another one, the number one recommendation that you have given is, say, planned cities than on the market-driven cities. But in the context of ours at the moment, we are market-driven, and that is what the fact is. That is what the, say, sometimes political influence is also on. So as a professional group, if we are advocating this non-market driven planned city forms, are we in a strong position to counter this, Doctor?
Yes, of course. I feel that you can, The market is a different situation. We are talking about intervention, and we have representation of rural folk, political representation of rural folk, and I don't think that those political personnel should forget who has voted them in, So, yes, I think in a democratic situation, you can do that.
Thank you, Doctor. Let's get on with the next speaker.
Thank you, Doctor. We now welcome Architect Professor Indrika Rajpaksha, who presented her ideas under the topic Equity in Urban Health, where she states that in low and middle income countries, health can be considered as the pulse of the new urban agenda. Architect Narathan.
Okay, so Professor Indrika, yes, it's very interesting and timely what you are dealing with, but I know that your research was not started just because COVID, because say I know for a fact that you started on this area a long time ago, and actually which culminated with this thing, but say your research is on this area is very, very important, and it's, I think it is very, say this time people would have understood the gravity of what you are talking. Now, there are two questions that I would like to raise into you, because you have in this research and maybe you have an idea of how do we bring the thoughts that you were talking and the best practices or things like that, how do you bring into the policy, and which area of policy? Is it onto medical, health, welfare, or environment, or combination of them in terms of policy? Number two, how do you bring that into the planning or physical planning policy? What do you think, what are the ways in which that within the context that we could do, or we might have to do change the context of our systems to achieve this?
Answer your question. Can you hear? Okay. Yeah. I think I have explained in detail in my presentation. When looking at the health, I would like to start answering this question by focusing on the latest concerns of WHO, that the health is beyond the medical professionals. It has social determinants as well as it has environmental determinants. So that means, when looking at the health, I would like to start answering this question by focusing on the latest concerns of WHO, that the health is beyond the medical professionals. It has social determinants as well as it has environmental determinants. So that means, when looking at the health, I would like to start answering this question by focusing on the latest concerns of WHO, that the health is beyond the medical professionals. It has social determinants as well as it has environmental determinants. every time when we design a building, do we consider health is important as professionals? So building would be the module which expands towards to the magnitude of bringing neighborhoods and cities. So health is, when we start thinking it, we are into siloed approach. We think building only as a building, but we don't think building is connected to people. It is a place, but it is connected with processes. So when you look at the policies in this country, housing policy is something individual, energy policy is something individual, urban policies are individual. So we have not thought of an integrated approach. So I would like, through the research, to present 2 examples. Look at the schools of this country. Where are they positioned? Take all the schools in city of Colombo, all are positioned facing to high traffic roads. What is a road? Look at the advertisement of apartments in this country. Accessibility. And also another important thing, I would like just to bring a sort of food for thought. PORS of UDA guideline. What is PORS? Public Open Recreational Spaces Standard. What has it highlighted? It says if you want to have an urban park or any recreational space in a city, accessibility is the priority. Why all the parks in this country facing traffic roads, highly polluted roads? And with that intention in mind, I took a research combined with medical faculty. We were monitoring particles emitted from these vehicles and the amount of pollution gets into the lungs of people. Question about the park design. All the walking tracks of these parks are positioned closer to the roads. That is where you inhale high volume of air. A day, a person gets with inhale 11,000 liters of air. That is 6,000 to 7,000 more than the amount you intake in terms of food or water. So when you inhale more pollutions, and this traffic pollution is with ultrafine particles, your natural systems cannot stop. And this study, we found the places where in the park, which is very much cleaner for the people to inhale, not a single person in that area. So this is just a basic finding, a fundamental to think of. So what I would like to express here is that it is very important that we get into integrated approach where all our policies have to think of. And the amount of energy consumed in air-conditioned building makes the atmosphere heated up. So the person who is wealthy is in a comfortable, cooling environment, at the same time heating. The places where the urban poor are, they are into heat strokes because they do not have, that is called energy poverty, because they don't have enough money or they will not switch on even a fan to make themselves cool. So this is the disparity between society. So the health is not that the poor people, we make them sick. So therefore we have to think, so my main focus is that we need to go for siloed approaches, away from siloed approaches towards integrated policies. I hope I have answered, Nawa.
Thanks. I think, say, that is where I wanted to direct you also, because, say, one of the conclusions that we have to look at today is how do we get into these integrated answers. Integrated answers in terms of spatial planning, and in that, of course, health is becoming, or as you said, it's going not only with the medical professionals, but the other professionals. Concerns are also important in this context of space planning as an integrated approach. So thank you, Professor Indrika. Let's get on with the next, Dr. Upendra.
Thank you, Professor. Next, we welcome architect Dr. Upendra Rajapaksha, who presented the topic Redefining Quality of Life, Urban Form, Climate and Energy, where he states that new currency to measure quality of life could be a system thinking to redefine quality of life, urban form, climate and energy. Architect Naratna, you can proceed.
Okay, thank you. So I think there are two things that I was very interested in what you are talking, Dr. Upendra. Number one is that you're saying a new currency measure, that is, say, to measure the quality of life, which is very good because, say, we were in the beginning of this, we have been discussing, I think we'll have to look at our value system change. So if our value system changes, it is not the monetary rupees and cents that we are looking at. It is, say, we have to look at another measure. So that is a system that you propose, and then quality of life and system thinking is what you are proposing. Rather than asking you a question, can you brief again and to this audience what your thoughts and what your thoughts beyond this and implementation, sort of what are the ways in which that we could implement, and how do we bring these things into a national policy and a physical planning policy?
Yes, thank you, Nawa. I'm happy to hear some of the key words today from some of the speakers, like new urban society. And then we heard environmental protection, natural system, revolution, cyclic economy, cyclic process. These are very unique components of sustainable development approach. So I think this is how we can integrate all these concerns in promoting a new quality of life. Currently, at present, most of us think that quality of life is something to do with luxurious facilities that we have. But in the system, new system thinking in any activity, the quality of life should be framed around the impact that your activities create on the nature. If you take one simple example, a building can create different levels of impacts on the nature. For example, due to a building, you need some sort of resources to produce and construct the building, and then after producing the building for its operation, you need simply energy. So use of energy create some negative impacts to the environment, like carbon emission, because to produce energy you need to burn fossil fuels, and that's the major disaster or global issue currently we are facing. So within that framework, we need to integrate all these thinking in the social aspects, all thinking in terms of or in the context of economic development, and then contextualizing or localizing our solutions. We need to think everything in a one framework which should mainly focus on ecocentric approach. That's why I made my presentation system thinking with ecocentric approach. So in that, now the question is, how do we implement this ecocentric approach in an urban environment? It's if you take current situation in any urban areas, for example in Sri Lanka, we don't see any kind of sustainable approach, because the systems that has been integrated in urban areas totally depend on artificial activities, or they are not independent, and they create many problems like the pollution, the energy consumption, and therefore its impact on the nature. So we need to think of simply an urban system with independent units, or independent clusters, or independent compact forms. And each independent compact precinct can have most of the activities related to housing, commercial, office, schools, etc., etc. So in this cluster form, these precincts can function independently, but they are important components of a larger system. So we need to think of implementing a more sustainable approach into this system thinking. Consists of clusters of various built forms, various built entities, and various functions, etc. So in this approach, even in case of a disaster, something like disaster of any kind of disaster, one entity can function without depending on a larger system. So I think this thinking can be integrated very easily in the implementation of planning and urban design initiatives.
Thank you. I think, that is compact self-defense clusters that you are talking of is one of the things that we could take out for our summary, because that's what Dr. Upendra is trying to promote. Let's get in with Professor Balasurya's presentation.
Thank you, Doctor. Our next panelist, architect Professor Lal Balasurya, is a past president of the SLIA and is the current head of the City School of Architecture, Colombo Limited. He presented insight on the topic Dependency of Cities in Rural Sector, where he highlights the need to strengthen the interdependence of rural with the urban and calls for a suitable arrangement for the city to give back to the rural, and questions, what does the city give back to the rural when receiving the produce?
Yeah, Professor, it was interesting listening to your presentation and new thoughts, and I felt that it links, what you are talking links very much with what Dr. Lochana was talking about, is say spreading it into the towns and then getting infrastructure. And you are adding something to it in your speech which interested me, was value addition at the point of production, which is a very important phenomenon. If what we are saying is bringing it into the township or stopping them at that point with certain social infrastructure given, as Dr. Lochana said, then there must be certain economic activity which could be looked at from the point of view of what you were promoting, that to do value addition at the point of production, and which is like, say, agricultural products. That's what I think what you meant by that. And then you will get this, this particular center or a small city or a small township getting economic strength as well. So can you elaborate on this, what you are thinking, Professor?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think you explained exactly what I was thinking of, but I think we can go a step further than that. Yes, value addition of produce of an area should benefit that particular area and not another area which utilizes it or takes it over and adds value and then sells it at that point. Now, the basic concept, and pardon me for oversimplifying a very complex issue here, Chair, if you take, say, the example of, say, our cinnamon. Now, our cinnamon is sold in bulk, and you know that our cinnamon is the best, probably one of the best quality cinnamon that you get in the world, because the other cinnamons that produces in China are acacias and various other things which are sometimes toxic. Now, our cinnamon is taken from the producer in the rural areas, brought to Colombo, bundled, and then auctioned and sold and taken out. Now, the value addition to that happens outside, because all of you who have gone abroad and try to buy a packet of cinnamon powder, you know what you are paying for that. And it's about 20 to 40 times more than what that producer gets. So the point that I'm trying to make here is, why can't we do that value addition at the point of production? Now, if you can think in those terms and go into a system where the producer is enabled and given the facilities, given the funds, given the necessary incentives like tax incentives and various things, and if you can produce that and packet it at the point of production, and that's what I mean by value addition, and then send it out or export it. Now, this would bring funds and the economy to that particular area where it is produced. Now, if you can do that, and again I say I'm simplifying a complex problem, if you can do that, you will find that that local authority where this is produced gets a certain income, maybe rates or taxes or whatever it is. And the people in that area are also given employment. Now, once you give employment to the people of that area, they also spend within that particular area. So the basic principle that I'm trying to get at, Chair, is that if you can improve the economy of a particular area, a local authority, then that local authority can generate sufficient funds for development of that area. Now, at the moment, if you take a village or some town, if you want to develop something, usually it happens that the ADB or the World Bank or someone has to give a loan and start development projects there. That is because the local authorities don't have the funds. And whatever funds that are generated there are taken by the central government. Now, this is a very simplified way of putting it. And I can give, cinnamon is just one of the examples. I can give you Chair, this is already beginning to happen. It's nothing new. It's happening in a small scale that maybe we don't realize. Now, let me give you an example of that. Take our jaggery. If you go back 10, 15 years, our jaggery was made into a polka tan, then it was wrapped up in a kandakole or something and then brought and sold. Now, can you export that? No. But now, someone has started packaging and packaging this into cubes and labeling it and made it exportable. Now, that is what I mean by value addition. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is don't do that value addition elsewhere. Promote that rural the area where they are producing this to do the value addition. Now, I'll give you another example, which probably lots of you are not aware of, which has been going on for a number of years, years and years, and you realize how much we are losing on this. Our eastern coastal areas in the bottom of the sea is covered with ilmenite. Now, ilmenite is harvested and brought to the land. It's the black sand that you see when you go to the beach. It's brought in and harvested, and if you go during the correct seasons, the monsoonal seasons in the eastern coast, you will see about half-inch thickness of black sand deposited there. That's all ilmenite. Now, that is brought in and then sold. And it's not brought into Colombo even immediately. It's taken off from Trincomalee Harbour and is sold out. And I think China is one of the biggest buyers. Now, apparently this ilmenite that we have here is 51% pure ilmenite compared to some of the other ilmenite that is produced. Now, what do the exporters do what do they do with it? They take it out and they convert it to titanium dioxide, which is a white powder which we use for whitening of our walls and so on. So we buy it back from them. Then also, titanium dioxide is the base product for producing titanium. Now, if you compare the prices, which I have done a long time ago when I went and discovered this, you will find that the value addition that takes place for that product is about 200 times. So what does Sri Lanka get out of it? What does the place like, the coastal regions where they harvest this or collect this get out of it? They get pittance. So our environment is being sold, our labor is being not used to the maximum, and at the same time, the areas where they should be making money out of this is getting pittance, and therefore, coming back to the topic of urban development and urban design, those areas do not have the funds to develop their own towns and villages. This is how I got around to it. I mean, to tie it up with the theme of urban design and rural development that you're talking about, these are indirect way of saying that if we can produce value add to our produce, and that's the term that you use, which is the term that I'm also using and trying to promote. If we can add value to the products in that same area, then I'm saying that those areas will benefit, and that will be the beginning of the rural development and the township development of those areas. This is, Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, is happening to our tea, rubber, coconut, and it has been happening to all the other products. There are so much of other agricultural products which are being wasted and not even utilized, which can be tinned and exported, but our country does not utilize them. So there is a vast potential for rural development. And whatever produce, take the rice even, we are buying the rice from our rural areas and bringing it to Colombo. But the rice molar hardly gets anything. The molar is making money, but the farmer hardly gets anything. So, but it's packaged somewhere else and sold and mass produced, sold somewhere else. So let me conclude because I have taken no more than my 3 minutes. Mr. Chair, what you said was correct. It's a question of value adding to the produce of your own area for the benefit of that area. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I think that's one of the points that we could record as concluding things in our discussion. Yes.
Thank you, Professor. Next, architect Harshan De Silva is the current chairman of the Urban Development Authority and presented the topic, the UDA's point of view on the way forward, where he outlines a unique national strategy termed Saubhagya Dakma to be executed in the next 5 years to include creating 4 multinational cities, connecting cities, coastal cities, cluster cities, and promotes specialized zones for development, for example, Port City, Hambantota, etc. And improvements to infrastructure and development system and transportation system is promoted to bring about equity not only in the cities but also in the suburb and the rural areas. Unfortunately, architect Harshan couldn't attend this session.
Yeah, Harshan is one of our members, so I think we can always in touch with him. Unfortunately, he not been able to come today, but he's on the hot seat. I think it would have been nicer if he had been here, but however, I think say what his presentation was basically highlighting what is the present context and what are the things that they are planning to do. So I think we all could listen to that and see, and then see whether whatever we are deliberating here is applicable, or whether there will be changes required, or whether we can inform with, I think SLI could discuss this with Harshan on personal basis and then take our message to him. Yeah, thank you. We'll go with Architect Pali.
Our next panelist, architect planner conservator, Pali Wijayaratne, is the Managing Director of Environmental Planning Services Private Limited and shared his views on the topic, the explanation of social impact assessment in urban regeneration schemes, a new vision for planning and evaluating options for city development. He calls for a comprehensive impact assessment criteria before approving a medium or large-scale project to assess the impact of the development to the community, and a new vision for planning and evaluating should include economic prosperity, environmental quality, social equity, and cultural heritage.
Town or city center developments cannot be designed by the town or spatial planners without any architects or urban designers in the team. Town or city that are of historic importance cannot be designed without the inputs of conservation architect in attendance. Otherwise, it will be like using a square peg in a round hole, or as the signal equivalent goes, accidentally. For the project to be successfully implemented, they should have the following ingredients: be people-centric rather than political-centric, include specific ways and means of uplifting the living standards of the local communities and lesser privileged members of the public, include the economics and the proposed development plans, a method statement of the plan implementation, monitoring process of the plan implementation and after, details of stakeholders, both public and private sector included, participation in the process at all stages, be firm in the monitoring process and not allow the developers to flout the law and get away with nominal fines. The fines should exceed the profit margins they would get from total development as a means of discouragement. Discourage the professionals from aiding and abetting such antisocial activities of the developers. Introduce the submission of social impact assessment reports for all major development projects, including high-rise developments within built-up areas. Therefore, before granting approvals, alternately, the developer should be called upon to pay a percentage of the total project to the planning authority to carry out such an assessment. This is similar to the archaeological impact assessment that is being carried out by the Department of Archaeology. They levy a 1% of the total cost of the project and appoint a team led by an archaeologist from outside to carry out the assessment report. In conclusion, may I take this opportunity, for the sake of sustainability and social justice, appeal to the planning authorities to reconsider the use of zoning as a tool of its development controls of future. Instead, I would like to direct your attention to the schemes adopted in Queensland, Australia. There, they introduced new development controls in such a way that they retain areas for agriculture and not continually subdivide and contain growth. They have introduced a new act with strict conditions in line with the philosophy of sustainability and good environmental practices. It protects biodiversity and conservation values more than individual growth. It prohibits nothing as long as the development conforms to the set environmental guidelines and physical and social infrastructure requirements. In theory, they say that developers can even put a nuclear power plant in Port Douglas, which is a thickly populated area, provided they can prove that it does not create noise or environmental pollution. Let me conclude in appealing to the authorities to follow up your marvelous development plans with a monitoring and implementation program that is people-friendly. Seek cooperation from your friends and colleagues in the professions locally rather than run to the foreigners for advice. It is more cost-effective and sustainable because we know our country better than all the foreigners put together, and hence we are more qualified to implement the 4 pillars of sustainability and the World Bank guidelines. In addition, please do not treat some developers as more equal than others, that is being antisocial and also not being professional. I appeal to the professional institutes to start a dialogue with government and authorities on the ways and means of giving them a hand to develop the country. In a socially and economically or environmentally acceptable form. Help them to get the best of professional inputs without political or other favoritism, and open the doors to all members rather than a favored few. I appeal to fellow architects that unlike the other oaths you have taken on material ideas such as obligations to other colleagues or to your clients, your social responsibility should come from your heart. It is an obligation you have to not only the present generation but to the future ones too. In addition, they should prove to the country their concerns and commitment for all 4 pillars of sustainability as described in the Lanka Commission report. Last but not the least, I appeal to the professionals in this country that they practice the culture they are born to, and that is to respect the elders. Please practice this principle when interventions and new development proposals are being considered in historic areas. The neighborhood settings should be given priority over the other factors, even though development should, in effect, reflect the spirit of age and spiritual time. Meaning the thoughts, materials, values and styles shall reflect the 21st century, but the new infill developments should not depict the arrogance of modernism, overriding the historic importance of the setting. After all, as John Ruskin, the famous architect, philosopher, social thinker, and art critic of the 19th century, wrote in his book, 7 Lamps of Architecture, that these old buildings and monuments belong partly to those who built them in the past and partly to the yet unborn future mankind. We are only caretakers and have no right to obliterate or vandalize them. Thank you.
Thank you, Architect Pali, for your presentation. I will directly get into the questions. You have touch lots of things, particularly it is evaluation of planning vision on economic prosperity, environmental quality, social equity, and cultural heritage is a new thinking that comes into our context because our environmental assessments are not touching some of these areas. And you also stated in your presentation that cultural identity must be also as much as possible to be preserved. My two questions that I would like to ask at once. One is that, say, what do you think this cultural identity in the rapid globalization context, how much it will be sort of, sorry? Yeah, say I have, say, two questions. One is, say, how do you look at the cultural identity in a rapidly urbanizing, globalizing context? That is one, because we are also catching up with globalization and some of the cultural identities might be losing in that sense. Then the second one is the evaluation of process of the equity process that you are of social and cultural heritage. Can you explain that more?
Mr. Chairman, two things. One is, in the first place, I would like to classify architecture as a social science coupled with anthropology and archaeology and economics and all the other similar subjects. Unless, of course, we classify architecture as a pile of bricks and mortar, or along with a few pipes and a few wires and a couple of sheets, metal sheets. So since we are tackling this on a social basis, we'll have to consider it as a social science, whereas every person is a stakeholder in these developments. So once we have taken that in, then we have to make sure that in our planning and evaluation process, everybody becomes a stakeholder, and more so the architects. Because in the 90s and the 20s, this tradition was there, and I think Lochi and Lal and all the others would vouch for it, that both UD and NPPD call for private sector architects to come into their teams and work with them. But somewhere along the line, that tradition went away. And now they're doing it on their own with no inputs from everybody else, but they would sometimes prefer to get the foreigners to come in and give them that input. Now, what is the social impact that they know of a Sri Lankan community? Now, this is a question we need to ask in this. Then also, I'll bring out a couple of examples of this. One is the recent Kurunagal incident. Everybody knows about it. But how many people have gone in and looked at the website to see the Kurunagal development plan? According to that development plan, that famous or infamous building is not even listed, not even mentioned in that development plan. And not only that, that development, in producing that development plan, there were no architects, no urban designers. And you are developing a town center. Then there are no stakeholder meetings except the government departments being discussed with. Now, is that a right solution? And they have only identified a few historic buildings or in Kurunegala. And one of them is being earmarked to be a 50-roomed luxury hotel. So I wonder how that historic building will fit into that luxury hotel. You see, now these are the issues that are coming up when there is no architect's role coming into it, an architect, particularly a local architect. So this is why I feel that we have a role to play in this, and that role has to be taken seriously. Individuals can't fight this case, but the Institute can. And it's something that the Institute should call for it and go back. I know now our present chairman, when he was working, he roped us all in to their departmental projects. So he can now put a different hat on and go back and tell them to turn the history back. But then also, I talked about the need for a cultural assessment report. Now, all this time, we have an archaeological impact assessment and an environmental impact assessment reports for projects, but not a socio-cultural impact assessment. Now, recently one was done for the port city. And I had the privilege to be a member of that thing. This is how I knew about it. But one of the things that I insisted at that time was, don't take the port city on its own, but with blinkers on, but incorporate Colombo Fort into it. And this was accepted even by the ministry, thank God for that. So we did an analysis of both these. And unfortunately, even then we looked at the EIA as well, and we found that 2 archaeological sites that was just outside the Galboka lighthouse have been buried in the sand. Archaeology department was called in to make an assessment on it. And they said, well, it is not 100 years old. Therefore, they took the measurements and they buried it. But under UDA law, because this is an area that is classified as a historic zone under the UDA law, and they had the right to list it and protect it, but they didn't, and they were not summoned, and this was not even called for. And in that EIA report also, there was no architectural inputs into it. It was purely an engineering input. And another thing that we realized in it was, they were taking from the national grid the power, they were taking water from the main systems here, and we don't have enough water, we don't have enough power for us. Where do we get this from then? Whereas they sit on 3 natural resources there. They could have set us an example on how to do it. Because their whole mission is to make it a world-class city, to be integrated into the Sri Lankan culture. So it's taking in Sri Lankan culture, but what they're doing is taxing us and destroying our culture rather than saving it for us. Even the popular culture there's a question mark in even our popular culture being promoted, because they have their own cultural activities coming in there. They're talking about tourism for the port city. But if you go in for the statistics of the World Tourism Organization, they talk about 40% of world tourists go in for cultural tourism and historic tourism. So that is something that we can explore within the Colombo Fort area. And that needs to be taken into account. So whilst the UDA is promoting, UDA and the government and everybody else is promoting the port city, there must be immediate plans for the development of Colombo Fort. And that is something that we as an institute, a professional institute or responsibility can take it up. And we can get our own members to come in. This is why I made that appeal, that the institute should take the lead role in this, to do that and bring our culture into that area rather than getting an imported culture into it. Did I answer your question?
Thank you. Yes. I think yes, there is, say, professional institute to play a role in this, definitely, with, say, planning as well as architecture and all those institutes. Shall we move on, because we are eating into time a lot? Yeah, next.
Thank you, Architect Pali. Architect Anura Ratnavibhushana, Honorary Fellow of the SLIA, lent his expertise and ideas on the topic of conservation development of pristine landscapes, where he outlines a preamble to regulations and recommends to emphasize the object and spirit to allow reasonable development while conserving the spiritual splendor and cultural legacy to future Lankans. Unfortunately, Architect Ratnavibhushana was not able to join us today.
In the speech, he had made a very, his paper, very interesting points, and he raised certain answers also. He proposes certain answers how we could actually get into the rural sector and development, and say those needs to be examined and then discussed further. So with that note, we will get on with Vidyajyoti Ashley DeVos's lecture.
Thank you, sir. Vidyajyoti Architect Ashley DeVos, Honorary Fellow of the SLIA. He promotes the need to create public spaces for vibrant and healthy community to promote successful, healthy livelihoods. The need to create places for people is challenged by unplanned urban growth and calls for a local solution for local problems. Unfortunately, Architect DeVos couldn't be present for today's session as well.
Yeah, Architect DeVos' presentation, I think, touched lots of area, and say naturally he is also bringing up certain points like high-rise, and when you build a high-rise, where is equity or where is equality in, say, social justice for the person who is at the ground level. So that's one of the basic points that he's talking about. At one point I thought that he's against, or he's not talking of high-rise, but some of the examples that he cited from outside Sri Lanka shows that what he's trying to say is, perhaps if it is inevitable, let's have it, but then we have to consider the ground and the scale and at what proportions that we could do, whether we could do without that as well. So there's lots of points that is there, so I will leave that also at that point, and I think he is also into mostly that believes, and he proposes that we can achieve high density with low rise development. So that brings in another aspect into this. Yeah, we'll go with Dr. Janaka.
Thank you, sir. Our next panelist, Architect Dr. Janaka Vijayasundara, is a lecturer at the University of Moratuwa and Principal Architect at Design Plan Associates, and presented the topic Evidence-Based Research for Urban Design in Sri Lanka and Other Developing Countries, a Comparative Analysis. He emphasizes the importance of the usage of detailed research in obtaining correct strata in decision-making in city development.
Therefore, basically they identified 5 to 6 locations, and these rhythms were studied throughout the day, stationing at different locations each of the time, observing people as well as the talking to people, as well as observing the vehicular arrangements there, and also various activities taken place uh, within this place. So it is. We also look at that how and most visited places in Galle. So we took local residents, local visitors, as well as tourists, foreign tourists. So we found a lot of different answers. Some are telling, particularly local residents are a little bit sort of reacting in different way. The visitors, both foreigners and local, reacting much similar way. And also we done with mind maps to understand how people reimagine the place or the most memorable places and so on. So we get results out of them. Then, so we actually synthesized all these data that we obtained through the rhythm analysis, and then finally came up into a kind of common understanding of the vision for the development in terms of various aspects that we identified, which may be important for the development of the port. So basically, it is final reflections were that so these fourth dimension, that is about the time and the time also to be utilized or used, and so, this actually to be, but I have just a brief about the use of rhythm analysis to obtain the data for the future development. So this is something that I would like to share with you, that our decisions strictly to be based on the sound and very much sensitive data, and we must come up with the new methodologies, ways of obtaining these data and analyzing to reflect what we decide on people is more appropriate and more correct and fair for them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Say we were evidence-based research is what we were focusing with Dr. Janaka. And I just thought that we have, as I said in the beginning also, say there is a need for us to have our theoretical works and then have checked it in our grounds, what are the evidence that we have and what are the things that we change. We should, whether we should change our parameters of values, say, can we adopt them in future? What do you think, say, what do you think of we developing our own parameters of urban assessment as well as certain design criteria proposals based on our own assessments or our own research and development, which is very little that we have done in our country. So in that context, that you say you look at this evidence-based research and how much it will be helpful to redefine some of the theories that we have learned from the West or certain scholars. That is one. Then number two, you have discussed in detail one of the examples of changes in Slave Island proves some theories what Dr. Seneka was talking about, say how this equity or inequality came into be and occupy the say, physical space. Can you explain those two? Number one is the, say, what are the, do you think that, say, research of original research in here, deriving new parameters will help us to develop ourselves? That number two is your experience with the slave island that you have spoke about.
Thank you very much, Nawa. I just want to highlight in my presentation one of the factors, it's central to the discussion here, that how much we are concerning about the social inclusion, social space in our development projects, and then how our research-based findings can focus quite sensitively, accurately to our programs. So the reason that I thought about that is we know that in the development of some areas in Colombo, especially, elsewhere as well, other cities as well, that these developments are taken place in such a way that completely the city, what is used to be continued, has been changed to a great extent. If you look at the central core area, that is in around Fort as well as Goldface area, that the new buildings coming up there is completely distracting or discontinuing with what is happening in the streets and public spaces, including the Bere lakefront as well as the seafront. Secondly, another example that I presented is that the road developments, street developments happening in and around Colombo. The area where I live, I see that the one most recent street widening project or the street improvement project, where there's no social space, there's no space for people to walk after the road is built, after the road is widened. Now you have only the drainage covers on top. You can walk just very, in a minimum facilities, as well as there's no any separation from the road or the vehicle area to the public space where people walk. It's same level. Normally should have a protective kind of barrier or a kind of level difference. So in fact, like these are the minimum standards that we were expecting, right? The privacy, not the privacy, the safety and the comfort. So currently, we are actually conducting a research at the Mortu University Department of Architecture Center for Cities, where we won a research grant from the World Bank to work on the assessment criteria, assessment model to check whether the public space, all the public spaces, including streets, playgrounds, nature areas, public squares, plazas, and so on, whether they are conforming to the minimum standards of the safety and the comfort. So it has been started last year. It is continuing. We have 2 more years to complete. So there's a team working on that for research, the PhD research students working with us. And so that would be something that we are trying to see, that whether these current international standards or standards set in South Asian region, so we will be looking at all the cities, all the places, and see that whether we can accept them into our situation or whether there are any variations, any modifications, alterations to be required for those standards in order to satisfy with our requirements, that public space, comfort, and the safety. That's one of the initiations. So I hope that we will be able to find some new way of looking into that with new standards, because we know that our society is different, our cultural setting is different, so people accept public spaces in different ways than the Western world. So therefore, whatever offered or whatever we learned from those theories, there will be certain, it's not something that we want to build a new theory, but it's a kind of retesting that certain aspect, certain theoretical settings, as well as the principles conforming to our standards. So I think my presentation, finally, I presented that some of the works that our Masters of Urban Design students did. I think I see some of them are here. And that is in Goldford, where we use the theoretical approach of Henry Lefebvre, its social space, to going into a much detailed surveys as given in these approaches, and check how the goal fort is working for that, and see that what are the key changes that you need to do, or key improvements that you have to do in terms of the movement use, and also the activity patterns and so on. So that's a kind of something that we try to apply certain theoretical models or the approaches into a local situation, bridging with the locational or contextual settings.
And surely we will be able to get certain results from that, Doctor. Yes.
Thank you, Doctor. We now welcome architect Hiranti Velendave, principal of HW Architects Private Limited, who shared on the topic of inclusive cities, in which she details the problem of accessibility created by inner city development and the need to legislate the connectivity of public spaces, which is essential to bring about a people-friendly city. Architect Naratne, you can proceed.
I think, we started with our discussions with lots of broad base, and then we went into details, and as, just now, Dr. Janaka stopped at details of even streets and the things. And I was very interested in Architect Hiranti's presentation, where she was trying to see even questions of privatization of public space and the accessibility and those issues in terms of context of Colombo. The other one, the question that I would like to ask her, sometimes in the, third world or our part of the world, the problem that we have is we might not have finances to develop our own public spaces. So the answer sometimes what we have gone into is using the public funds, public space, privatized certain public spaces, and the private sector is developing these public spaces. What I would like to ask you is, in that context, of course, you were talking of malls and things like that. In context, do you think that, certain legislations or certain other parameters, if we really implement, will we be able to use these public, private built public spaces so that they will be not purely on commercial grounds, but they also will look at the other social groups who are using in and around those spaces that they create. So do you think that there is a possibility for it due to the basic factor that, maybe we might not have money and financial economic strength to do that? And then how do you make it for everybody, like, for example, a space like Goldface, which was there, and which is changing, of course, as Dr. Janaka said. So how do you think that we should approach this and tackle this situation?
which is recommended by the World Health Organization. It says that for one person, you need 9 square meters. So if you just take the inner city of Colombo, we would need at least 600 hectares of open space to create a livable, healthy city. So the whole point is, like with our economy, it is impossible to, I think, expect the state to provide all this. And the only way that we can harness the private sector to become a participant of developing public spaces like this is, I think, only through legislation. We can, of course, offer, I think we should look at where we have a win-win situation, because the private sector is always looking for making more profit. And if you, in some way, allow more development facility on their plots on the basis that they allow land for public use. But of course, this has to be done in a kind of planned manner. I don't think it will really work if you have little bits of garden here and there. And for that reason, the Urban Development Authority must they must have a vision for the city on how this development could be taken forward. And based on that, you identify, okay, these are the plots which will be used for that, and create a method through legislation. So it has to be balanced, of course, with something that you give them for that. And of course, they will benefit, because if they have a place which is more accessible, whatever activity which goes on there will have more value.
Yeah, thank you. I think what perhaps, Hiranti, what we are talking of is say, what we have is a set of regulations. So we have to go beyond that.
Yeah.
And we'll have to have something like urban design guide plans, where we specify where these public spaces should and how they interconnect, and then what we expect from the developer of those particular plots, and specifically in terms of physical design interventions which should be given, and so that they cannot, as you said, say, you say 20% of open space or 30% of open space or 50% of open space, that is provided, but that might be a road. So at the end, you have provided 50% open space, but there's no value in that. So unless we get into urban design guide plans where we talk of these densities and all these things, we might not be able to achieve it.
Yeah, I think kind of micro level urban design plans have to be developed to envision this kind of development.
Exactly, yes. Thank you, Hiranti. We can go ahead.
Finally, we welcome architect planner Veranjan Kurukula Surya, who is the current president of the SLIA. He is also an urban planning, designing and heritage specialist under the Strategic Cities Development Program of the Urban Development Authority. He presented the topic Evolution of a Macro-Scale Strategy, where he provides a comprehensive introduction to the evolution of the National Physical Plan.
Okay, thank you. This is our president, so he's to go last. I went through your presentation, but I have read something in between when you present. You deliberately, in my view, I might be wrong, didn't express certain thoughts, maybe for reasons that you cannot do that. But then the discussion that we have that has taken place today have shown that number one, the policy and the physical plan the missing link or the missing implementation agenda. And then the strength, perhaps the physical planning sector or the department has in implementing it or implementing through UDA or certain other organization is perhaps there's a gap. So having had, as you presented yourself, that having had this long experience of physical planning experience, and now we all know that that has not been implemented to its fullest benefit to the country. What do you think, where is it going wrong? Is it, say, I know how much effort that you would have made to make the policy and the plan connected in this Sri Lankan context. It's a battle itself. But then, having said that, we shouldn't stop at that, and we should go and try to implement those physical plans. But there is an issue somewhere that it is getting blocked or not being, say, implemented, or no, perhaps, political will to implement it. What do you think? Where do you think that, say, it's not in terms of criticism, but in terms of where is this happening, and where could we, as institute or as Architect Pali said, where we could intervene, or where could we lobby and then get these things done? Perhaps we were also, as Institute of Architects, we were not interested in this because we were interested in on our own projects and small scales, not in the national level. We were not getting involved adequately. So what is your opinion on this, President?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, actually, the National Physical Plan is only I would say it's a structure plan. It's the structure of the country, the development of the country, or the conservation. Now, there are certain provisions in the plan that are not popular, especially with the politicians. Now, for instance, the Central Hills, these are the water source of this is the water source of the country. Conserving the Central Hills is of prime importance if we are to survive the predicted water scarcities in the future. However, already there are certain areas developed, urban areas. Canvassing for a reduction of the population in the Central Hills is not a popular measure. And the National Physical Plan, there's nothing called implementing a National Physical Plan. The National Physical Plan must be followed by regional physical plans, maybe based on provinces or some other criteria. And that should be the basis for the UDA to prepare their own urban plans, and Pradeshia Sabhas to prepare their own plans for their areas. The detailing should follow the guidelines given by the National Physical Plan. Now, for instance, when the Town and Country Planning Act was amended, the UDA Act was amended simultaneously, and there's a provision, Section 8, to say that all the plans prepared by the UDA must follow the guidelines given in the National Physical Plan. So they do that. They ask the NPPD for guidelines. So especially for towns and urban areas in the hilly areas, the NPPD gives their guidelines. So the urban plans must follow those guidelines. So that is the way in the National Physical Plan gets implemented. It gets implemented through other agencies like the UDA or planning institutions, and also the RDA, Water Board, etc., etc. if there is a gap, if there is a overlooking of the provisions in the National Physical Plan, those are the trespassers of the political authorities that we have to accept. So the NPPD, being a government department, cannot, of course, go to courts against the political authorities, or they can't even go to courts against any other government agency, which is not very polite. So that's the obstacle to the National Physical Plan. However, nature finds a way of punishing this kind of diversions. And we have seen all these areas, all the landslides, what is happening in the Central Hills, and people and the politicians are beginning to see the merits of the National Physical Plan. So slowly, the acceptance of the National Physical Plan in 2007 and the acceptance of the National Physical Plan in 2020, there's a huge difference. Everybody talks about the National Physical Plan now, but they were not talking about it way back in 2007. So there's an improvement, and I hope it will continue to improve.
So in the context where, say, okay, National Physical Planning Department can't go to courts with or challenge the other department, but since it is cabinet-approved proposals and gazetted proposals, public could do that.
Of course.
Public could do that, and public could ask the others why you are not implementing it. And you can challenge the physical planning department as well if you want to, because you are not, say, that department is supposed to look after our interest. So I know it's in the Sri Lankan context, those are again different approaches that one could take. But then the best is that we make sure that, say, these physical plans, if that is acceptable, and then say that we as institutes and professionals participate in the preparation process, as well as then making sure that, say, pressure is made for implementation. Because I think that is the answer that we might have in this context, as say, now since you are not wearing the other hat, as Dr. Say, Architect Pali said, you might be able to now wear the hat of SLIA and then sort of make that pressure. It's not, I'm not asking to go to courts, but then if there is anything that is happening, as he rightly said, sometimes our opportunities of getting into this system and then doing certain things. And having said that, the other thing that you talked about is getting into the local authorities and giving the local authorities chances to design. They don't have resources to do that. So, and UDA, I think you also participated with me and the others, say we have gone and discussed this urban design guide plans and why don't you do it? And their answer was also lack of resources. So, might be the answer is that we promote that the private gives it to private sector, because they are consulting with, say, certain huge amount of dollars of international consultants, but they could consult the Sri Lankan consultants, as Architect Pali was promoting, to do certain things where they don't have resources, and this new intervention might be another way forward, so that say both professional also win as well as the institution also will win, and going back to the old examples what he was referring to might be the answer. So President, then I will try to conclude this as soon as possible. You are the last presenter, and say I think I will give one questions to the audience Unfortunately, we are running really, really late. It's 9:40 now. I will give one question to the audience. Any questions? You're so tired, no questions. Sure.
Quality of life, probably, maybe a question needs to be asked from each and every person. In terms of quality of life, where do you think that our current process probably this Dr. Upendra may be the right person to sort of answer this question. Now, I believe when you design cities and towns and all that, that can really affect the way of living and the quality of life of the users. So in this context, do you see in production of these spaces, do you see a feasible and a sort of a identifiable mechanism that is evident in the current practices in addressing these issues?
Yes, quality of life, it's very simple in the context of sustainable development. Right? Any activity, any human activity should focus on minimizing damage to the environment. So quality of life in buildings, quality of life in between buildings in urban areas should be focused on minimizing the dependence on the environment, right? So that's the fundamental need of today in any society, whether here in Sri Lanka or in the global context, because we have many global issues, global problems, and that is common to everyone, every one of us, irrespective of the economic levels and education level. So therefore, our activities should primarily focus within the framework of sustainable development and sustainable design, whether it is for the society or for the people or for economic development or whatever. So every activity should be focused on this framework, the ecocentric approach, and if you can implement this at different scales at the building design level, and then the urban design, the regional planning, or town and country planning level. So in order to do that, you need to understand the climate. For example, in tropics, the climate is one of the main problem that we have, but unfortunately we don't understand and we don't see the effect of negative effect of climate. For example, the disasters due to climate and climatic environment and climatic behavior in tropics, especially because in the years to come, in other several, in 20, 30 years, the climate in warm, humid areas, especially in tropical region or tropical belt, the environment, the air temperature or the ambient temperature could can rise up to unbearable situations, and even all the urban activities, the reflection from built services, then the traffic congestion can create more pollution in the environment, and that can contribute to the increase of heat. So therefore we need to predict the negative effect of these climates, and then we need to design, plan our entities to respond to that and to mitigate the effects of bad effects or negative effects of this area. So it's very, it's not difficult. It's very, if we have a proper regulations and framework or a legal framework, and also the attitude change of people. We need everything in a very holistic manner to be implemented at every level, even at the education level, practice level, and even government decision-making levels. So then we need to have a holistic framework, and that framework should be a frame around finding new definition for quality of life.
Thank you. I think he answered the question, and I think I will want to conclude before just 1 minute of your time. I think we started with lots of broad understanding of the economics, and then we went on to social, cultural, and then we went into nitty-gritties and then research, and it's a huge, vast area of things that we discussed today. Actually, it's perhaps a 1 day or 2 day a session requirement. I think it's very hard for me to bring it down within this 1 hour, but I think we exceeded 1 hour. But one thing what I should tell you is that you could go back and read again or listen again the YouTube presentations, and they're very, very informative, and everybody must read it, and we should come into a conclusion of what we as architects and Sri Lanka Institute of Architects could do to the future of this country and contribute with our institute, and how do we find solutions to this. So there is, whatever it is at the end of the day, perhaps we have not gotten complete conclusions out of this CPD, but we have addressed the required issues adequately, I think, for you to start thinking on these lines. So if we have done that, if we have started your brains working on the lines that we have discussed, then we have achieved. But I think there are few conclusions which I know Dr. Senaka was writing next to me, certain conclusions, and then certain, perhaps certain ideas that we have gathered today will be presented and summarized by him. So I will thank you all, and definitely the presenters, everybody. Thank you for your participation and your contribution with these difficult times. And we have had a good session, and yet still it is there. I mean, it's not like a normal seminar which comes and goes. This is a webinar which has in the web. So we will go there and then again start our discussions on this, and it will not end just here, but we can continue to understand and try to understand what each expert was trying to say. So thank you very much again for everybody, and I will now leave it in the hands of architect to continue with the proceedings.
Thank you, sir. At the end of session 2, I now invite architect Dr. Senaka Dharmatilaka, chairman of the CPD committee, to present the final summary of this ECBD Q&A.
Yeah. Well, it's quite hard to summarize such an evening of so much of intellectual input and so on. I think it's been quite a heavy dose for all of us. But let me try to kind of make it as quick as possible. First of all, I must thank Dr. Wagisha, who brought in this fantastic catchphrase to kind of, or the solid basis to start with, to look at urbanization as being built up upon capitalist structures, and capitalist structures being built up upon social inequalities and environmental injustices. So in remedy to this, where we talk about the triple bottom line, profits, people, and planet, as a guideline to be followed by the private sector. Now, one of the questions was, how to bring about urban transformations while being mindful of ensuring social equality without allowing polarization. And in this whole realm of how this revolution could happen within this neoliberal greenwash efforts, what Dr. Vagisha brings in is as a remedy is to rethink processes and to rethink progress. And how by transforming the linear or what we call non-sustainable processes of consumption, by transforming them into cyclic or sustainable process of consumption, where the byproducts of consumption could be brought back to feed in the production process itself. She thinks that she brings out this solution that we could mitigate the wastage of finite resources and to use them in an optimum manner. And also brings in the question as to not only to look at the problems of urbanization, but to relook at why the rural to urban migrations happen, so that you can nip it in the bud where the problem itself starts. And Professor Madam Vedikar, talking about the issues of equity, urban equity, a strong advocate and my teacher, she talks about how the gap between the haves and have-nots keep broadening. And in this process of looking at solutions to bring in equity or urban equity, she brings in the solution that it is a matter of leveling the playing field, and how to achieve this is a matter of the mindset. I think that's a fantastic point of view to look at, to revisit Mr. Architect Navaratna's question of how values themselves could change the way we look at the mitigation of polarization. And Professor Vidikar brings in this, brings in this solution, how to bring in change of perception by possibly by government intervention in imposing guidelines on how to help change the psychological paradigms of living and proximity to different socio-economic groups, which is a fantastic way of looking at a fresh approach. Then Professor Willie Mendes, of course, we sadly miss him today. He's at home, but his outlook on the lack of professional contribution to administrative and implementation of projects as widening the gap between the policy planning and physical planning at a national level was, of course, done justice by most of the speakers today. So Dr. Lochana Gunawardena also talked about the need for planned urbanization and the development of small and medium-sized towns to mitigate the agglomeration of rural migrants to big cities. Or to I am privileged to have had knowledge of his recently published book called Managing Urbanization in Southeast Asia, where he talks about this in very much detailed approach, or how to prevent the urban primacy. And here he talks about how, to the question that whether all facilities in large cities can be given to small and medium towns, where Professor Dr. Lochi says no. But he very candidly says how some of these critical elements could be brought in, such as the social infrastructure, should be brought into the small and medium scale towns, such as the educational facilities, schools, and the medical facilities such as hospitals. I would rather also include the social infrastructure of law enforcement, as well as communication into these critical facilities he talks about. And also, one of the key things that Dr. Lochi brings in is not only to look at these facilities, but the main objective is to fulfill the hopes and opportunities of these rural to urban migrants, and how to support the, rather than looking at facilities themselves, and the need to support the non-market driven planned cities by using the political representation and the clout held by the block votes in these in the rural areas, which are, of course, proportionately much larger than the urban areas in our Sri Lankan context. So Dr. Indrika Rajapaksa, who brought in the idea that health, the equity of health should be designed into the design of urbanity of the country, and replied to this question on how do we bring the integration of health equity into the design of cities in terms of policy. And as an answer, in answer to this question, Dr. Indrika Rajapaksa notes how health is beyond the medical professionals, and that it has social determinants and environmental determinants, which we architects and urban designers can address as a group. And here she very strictly notes how as a root cause, how the individualization of policies into policy silos has caused much of these issues in terms of urban inequality of healthcare and urban health, and how this should be avoided. And as a remedy, Dr. Indrika Rajapaksa, Professor Indrika Rajapaksa brings in that the integration of different parameters of urban healthy life could be achieved by a well-coordinated geospatial approach, such as locating urban parks and public spaces in areas which do not feature a large amount of air pollution, such as being next to busy highways and polluted industries, etc. Then Dr. Upendra Rajapaksa, who brings in the aspect of quality of urban quality of life to be equitable, and looks at how this could be brought in as a policy approach, in terms of policy, by following an ecocentric approach, which in the presentation he calls as latitude specific, and how a new urban design approach of polycentric and self-contained clusters, which can contain even medical emergencies such as the pandemic situation, could be brought about by integrating these polycentric structures with and their communities with the natural ecosystems. Then coming to Professor Lal Balasurya on the coexistent or the advocacy for economic symbiosis between the city and the hinterland or the rural areas, which is a very critical area that we studied at the macro scale. He looks at how to do valued addition at the point of production in the rural areas of the agricultural as well as other products, to ensure the contribution to the rural sector itself. So here, as an answer what Professor Balasurya brings in is that how the policy planning could enable the producers, such as giving government-based incentives to packaging and processing of the products at the source by the producers themselves, to increase their profits and to increase and generate more employment in the localities, and also to increase the revenues within the localities, so that these increased revenues could contribute to the local development of physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, etc. And coming to architect Professor Hansa de Silva, the chairman UD, of course, sadly we miss him today. But his main ideas of identifying the critical geographic areas for development, such as the specialized zones for development, which are related to ports and airports, such as the 4 main areas like Hambantota, Jaffna, Colombo, and Trincomalee, which have been very well captured in his speech, could provide a lot of food for thought and later debate and discussion. Then architect Pali Vijayaratna, one of my own teachers, would talk about the social equity and cultural and heritage identity. So cultural heritage and cultural identities, and how do we identify cultural, the different cultural identities in a rapid urbanization, the question was asked, and the answer is that he looks at architecture as a social science, which is integrated with sociology, anthropology, etc., rather than looking at architecture as a mere brick and mortar approach or a material approach. And here, architect Vijayaratna sees how we can see everyone as a stakeholder by adopting this approach as an integrated, as a cohesive professional who looks at anthropology, sociology, beyond our technical capabilities, and how the administrative framework could facilitate this by and this different way of looking at projects, and how in this spirit he would advocate a social impact assessment for all projects, just like we do environmental impact assessment and traffic impact assessment. And he advocates the view that our own institution, the SLIA itself, could play a lead role in advocating and implementing these approaches. Then, of course, architect Anuradha Vibhushana, who did a wonderful series of sketches in terms of preserving pristine landscapes. Also, we miss him. And the presentation itself could give you enough and more food for thought, which we would reserve for another day to discuss. And then architect Ashley DeVos also brought in his very enlightening ideas of how public spaces could be used for vibrant, healthy communities, and he calls for humane cities and believes in responsive environments, so to speak, through low-rise developments and intimate scales, low speeds, and the symbiotic relationship between vehicles and human beings in his wonderful presentation. Well, architect Janaka Vijayasundara brought in this, brings in how academia could play a vital role in this, in our endeavors, by looking at evidence-based research to enhance the creation and the design of good urbanities or healthy cities. And this brings into mind Professor Christopher Benninger's advocacy of intellectual honesty, where our theoretical frameworks should be based on facts on ground, and where we have to be honest to objective facts in fabricating our theoretical frameworks and so on. So Dr. Janaka explained how these symptoms of the problem of areas such as the public realm being eroded and the pedestrian being disenfranchised of the circulation space he deserves, by looking, by taking observations such as in urban transformation, such as the shrinkage of the sidewalks, etc. Now, so this is to kind of literally to test the theoretical frameworks brought in to analyze our own localities, our own urbanities, by kind of testing the robustness of these theoretical frameworks which are generated elsewhere, based on the facts on ground, and so that these theoretical frameworks themselves could be contextualized properly. Then architect Hiranti Velandava brought in who looks at at the question of how do we finance the creation of equitable public spaces in under the financing abilities of the private sector, and looks at the fact that Colombo does not have the proper proportion of or the minimum extent of public space, and brings in the assumption that it's through legislations that we can introduce more public space by inducing the private sector to help financing these spaces. And also, she very smartly talks about how the government itself or the professionals could convince the private sector on how the public activity in these spaces could enhance the value of these privately owned properties. This brings into mind how the Singaporean government looks at the public-private partnership by bringing up what you call a business plan, which makes sure that both the parties would have a win-win situation. So, an example for this would be the kind of public realm that was developed along the Orchard Road, where the introduction of EPLs, the elevated pedestrian links, and the UPLs, the underground pedestrian links, that links the the MRT stations into to all the shopping malls along Orchard Road, was done by a win-win situation or a business plan that brought in for the developers who developed an underground tunnel or an elevated public pedestrian link to be given a portion of that the elevated public link or on either side of the tunnel for his own merchandising, which is liberated from the FSR or the floor space ratio, and also by giving a 5-year tax free period or tax incentive for on the point of sales in their turnover. So architect Hiranti brought in this very valid idea of how the private sector developers also could be convinced of the potential of enhancing their values in allowing public space within their property itself. Then finally, last but not least, architect Veranjan Kolakuru Surya was asked, would answer this question as to where we are going wrong in the disconnect between policy plan and the implementation. Of course, as he explains very very well, he talks about how the national physical plan itself is a structure plan, and how this gets implemented by other authorities such as the local authorities, UDA, etc. And the only control or the connect between these two will be the need to follow the guidelines set by the NPP. And sadly, he observed how the disconnects occur only through what you call the trespassers on the NPP guidelines by political forces, in which case the litigation on such trespassers by the affected authorities become rather difficult. And as a remedy, what was brought in as a consensus was that such voices against these trespassers could be brought in by professional bodies such as ours, where we as architects could make a voice against such trespassers, and as a national duty or as a social obligation, where we could stand up by the need to uphold good practices, good guidelines laid down by the National Physical Plan. So with that, I think I must have sufficiently summed up the contributions by all our esteemed presenters, and I would pass on the proceedings back to Architect Shadia, who had been doing a very good job in not only in handling this event, but also helping me with with compiling the video clip that compiled all the presentations of these the panelists and the presenters. Thank you, Shadia.
Thank you, sir. I would now like to welcome the President of the SLIA, Architect Veranjan Kurukulusurya, and Chairman of the PAB, Architect Upendra Randenia, to present some tokens of appreciation to our distinguished panel. Right. Dr. Vagisha Gunasekara. Architect Professor Chitra Vedikara. Architect Dr. Lochana Gunaratna. Architect Professor Indrika Rajapaksha. Architect Professor Lal Balasuriya. Architect Pali Vijayaratna. Architect Dr. Janaka Vijayasundara. Architect Hiranti Velendave. And Architect D.B. Navaratna. Thank you, sirs. And thank you to our distinguished panel of speakers for providing their expert insight into the different aspects of the theme, Inclusive Cities. Please welcome Architect Nandaka Jayasinghe to present the vote of thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's 10:10, and as the smells and sounds of food being prepared fill the space, I am now the bad guy holding up an entire room from having dinner. But a round of thank yous is definitely in order. And I'd like to do so on behalf of SLIA, and I'll ensure that I keep things very short. Our speakers for this evening included Dr. Vagisha Gunasekara, Professor Chitra Vedikara, Dr. Lochana Gunaratna, Professor Indrika Rajapaksha, Dr. Upendra Rajapaksha, Professor Lal Balasuriya, Architect Pali Vijayaratna, Dr. Janaka Vijayasundara, and Architect Hiranti Velandava, and Architect Veranjan Kurukulusurya. Thank you for making time to be part of the discussion today, and moreover, for your contribution towards compiling the documentary video. I wish to extend my gratitude to Professor Willie Mendis, Architect Anuratna Vibhushana, Architect Harshan De Silva, and Vidya Jyoti, Architect Ashley DeVos. Though they couldn't be here today, their involvement in this program is acknowledged. I thank our moderator this evening, Architect D.B. Navaratna, for conducting the proceedings in a clockwork-like manner. Architect Shadia Jamaldeen, thank you for taking on multiple roles in this project. And of course, in today's event as compeer and coordinator. I'd like to thank the chairman of the CPD committee, Dr. Senaka Dharmatilaka, and the CPD committee for all their efforts in the last few weeks. And I congratulate them on a well-managed event. We eagerly look forward to more and more CPD events of this nature. I would also like to express my gratitude to Architect Upendra Randenia, Chairman of the Professional Affairs Board, for bringing about eCPD events of this nature. And I'm sure the new infrastructure being procured by the PAB on behalf of SLI will facilitate bigger and better events in the future. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the Secretariat staff for their support this evening. A big thank you to Reshan and the Event Cloud team for the AV support. I'd also like to thank Lanka Steel Company Limited, our sponsor this evening. And last but not least, I'd like to thank everyone here who took time off their busy schedules to be here. And of course, everyone logging in online at this point in time. Thank you. And with that, we conclude the event. There is dinner served outside.
ලොවපුරා සීක්‍ර සංවර්ධන ක්‍රියාදාමයක දොරට විවර වන විට වානේ සොයා ගැනීම මිනිස් ඉතිහාසයේ වැදගත් කාර්යභාරයක් ඉටු කළේය. අද වන විට ශ්‍රී ලංකාව ඉදිකිරීම් කර්මාන්තයේ ඉහළටම ගමන් කරමින් පවතින අතර GI පයිප් සහ නල සඳහා ඉහළ ඉල්ලුමක් පවතී. ඉහළ යමින් පවතින මෙම ඉල්ලුම සපුරාලීම සඳහා ටයන් ලංකා පිහිටවන ලද්දේ ෂැන්ඩොං ෂෙන්හෝන් සමාගම් සමූහය සහ ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ ලූක් ස්ටීල් යන සමාගම් අතර උපාය මාර්ගික හවුල්කාරීත්වයක් වශයෙනි. ටයන් ලංකා යනු ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ GI පයිප් නිෂ්පාදනයේ පුරෝගාමී වන අතර අද වන විට විවිධ අවශ්‍යතාවන් මත විවිධ පරාසයන්ගෙන් පුළුල්ව නිෂ්පාදන කටයුතු සිදු කරනු ලබයි. කාලගුණික හා දේශගුණික තත්ත්වයන්ට මනා ලෙස ඔරොත්තු දෙන ආකාරයට නිෂ්පාදනය කෙරෙන පලංචි සහ ප්ලේට් පාරිභෝගික අවශ්‍යතාවන්ට ගැලපෙන ආකාරයට මෙරටදී නිෂ්පාදනය කරනු ලබන උසස්ම තත්ත්වයේ නිෂ්පාදන ක්‍රියාවලියක් සතු ප්‍රමුඛතම ආයතනය. ටයන් ලංකා ස්ටීල් පුද්ගලික සමාගම බව අප ඉතා සාඩම්බරයෙන් සඳහන් කරන්නෙමු. පිටරටින් මෙරටට පලංචි සහ ප්ලේට් ආනයනය කිරීමේදී ඇතිවිය හැකි සියලුම අවහිරතා වළක්වා ගනිමින් පාරිභෝගික විශ්වාසය උපරිමයෙන් දිනා ගනිමින් ජය මාවතේ ඉදිරියටම පියමනින ටයන් ලංකා ඔබ සැමගේ ශක්තියේ විශ්වාසය වෙනුවෙන් නිබඳවම කැපවී සිටී.